Well, today we find ourselves in 1 Samuel chapter 24. We're going to look at 22 verses here. This is one of the most incredible stories that you'll find concerning the life of David. I've chosen this particular text because we're focused on fathers today. And I believe that you're going to find that here in this text are the traits of a righteous man, David. In fact, I think we'll find 6 of those specifically that I'll mention today. This is an incredible text. I'm fascinated by it and humbled by it at the same time. To give you a little bit of background, when you arrive at this particular text in 1 Samuel 24, we must remember that David has been on the run from Saul. He's been running, he's been hiding. Saul, the current king of Israel, is out to take his life. But what you will see from David is that he understood no matter how evil Saul was, and Saul was evil, the fact remained that God had appointed him and anointed him as king. But Saul was out to kill David. He knew that David would be the next king, and his jealousy and his envy toward David and all that God was doing in David's life was ruling his heart. And so he sought to kill David. It enraged him. In fact, when he heard that David and his men were seen and they were somewhat close by in the desert of En-Gedi, he gathered 3,000 of his best soldiers, chosen men, to hunt down and kill David. Interestingly enough, in the text, they are moving along. This is a very desert region, mountains, caves in the mountains. You see this whole caravan of 3,000 soldiers. Saul is probably somewhere near the front or in the middle, protected. And he brings the whole caravan, the whole troop movement to a stop. He has the privilege, because he is the king, he's going to relieve himself, and he wants to find a private place to do that. And so he goes up into a cave there in the mountains. And it is not by coincidence that he goes into the cave in which David and his men are hiding, back in the recesses and the darkness of the cave. This is a divine appointment that God has set up. And it is to test David and to display David's heart for God. There's a significant amount of things that are taking place here in David's life. But I want to draw your attention to verse 16 and 17 before we get started in breaking this down. It says, when David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is this your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. And here's what he said in 17. He said, "You are more righteous than I." This is Saul speaking. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly." Saul acknowledges, because David did not take his life, that he was more righteous than him, because Saul was hunting him down to take his life, yet David spares his life, and Saul acknowledges in front of everyone that David was more righteous. So we want to look at the 6 traits of a righteous man this morning. Men, if you're here today and you're a father, these traits should be a part of your life, my life. If you're soon to be a father, or one day will be a father, if you will learn these traits today, they will help you be a man after God's own heart. I do want to say, as a point of clarity up front, David didn't always get it right. We know that. He was not perfect. In fact, he made some terrible mistakes in his lifetime. But this is a text in which he does get it right, and we are to learn from this. And I want every man in the room to learn. And not just for men, but anyone in this room. Ladies alike, listen. These principles are principles to put in play because they're spiritual principles. But we see them in this man, David, who will one day be king. 6 traits of a righteous man. The first is simply this: a righteous man can resist temptation. And specifically here, it is revenge for David. Beginning in verse 3, it says this: He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, now these are David's fighting men that are with him, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." This is the whispering that's going on in the back of the cave. Then David crept up unnoticed, cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He had set his robe to the side. And David crept up and he cut off the corner of his robe. There's a lot going on here. We must remember David has been on the run. Surely he's tired of being chased. He's tired of running and hiding day after day, month after month. He's tired of being slandered, as Saul was saying things that were not true about him. He's literally tired of the entire ordeal. And when such an opportunity arises where you can put into your own hands your future, and you can end all the running, you can end all the chasing and the hiding and the slander, all of it. It is an enormous temptation to David and to his men at this very moment. This is a tipping point. David and his men who are in the back of the cave, they've had time for their eyes to adjust. They have the advantage. They can see. They have the element of surprise. One thrust of the sword and the whole thing would be over. No more running, no more hiding. Immediate, for his men, immediate promotion and power. David would be king immediately. These men would go home, they would go to their families, they would hold positions of honor and power, and everything rested on this very moment of decision. Obviously, David's men saw it as God's provision to end it all, right here, right now. The advice was given. You see it in verse 4. They said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." That's what they said to him. And so David is taking this in. But here's the problem. God has never been known and never will be known for giving us days of revenge. Revenge is so easy, listen, to justify and to spiritualize. It is our human nature to defend ourselves and then justify our defense in the face of unfair and undeserved attack. And that's exactly what Saul was doing to David. And when this happens to us, as it was happening to David, we must be careful. F.B. Meyer said, "Opportunity does not make a wrong thing right." And now he's right about that. So David considers the opportunity that is before him. All of a sudden, here is the king, the one that is pursuing him. He has the advantage. He can see him. He can creep up and sneak up on him. He has the element of surprise, and he can take his life. And his men are telling him, this is God giving you this opportunity. And so he decides to take action. He creeps up in the darkness of the cave to make his move. He cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. But now I want us to give consideration to what was taking place during this creeping and this cutting. And I want to say to you men that there was an intense internal battle that was raging inside of David. It went something like this probably. Oh, this is my opportunity. I will kill Saul. This will be done right here, right now. And oh, the relief that will come. And today, in just a moment, I will be king. Immediate satisfaction and relief was the temptation that was drawing him in. but it would not be the case. That's how temptation is. There's always a disappointment on the backside. But then there was a voice, I promise you, that he was hearing that said, no, don't kill Saul. He is God's anointed. David, keep waiting. David, trust me. David, listen. And I'm telling you, there was this internal battle inside of David. Kill Saul. Don't kill Saul. Kill Saul. This is your opportunity. No, trust God, Saul. Don't do it, David. Don't kill him. And there was this internal battle that was going on. And oftentimes when this takes place, we have a habit of wanting to sell ourselves on why the action would be okay instead of listening to God. And so the real question I want to ask you is, when this happens for you, whatever your situation may be, for David it is revenge. For David it is relief from being pursued and hunted down. Do you listen to God or do you sell yourself? This is very important. Do you sell yourself on all the reasons why you should, or do you listen to God, and when He's putting the brakes on and telling you not to, that you say, okay, God, I'll trust you? In a very practical way, have you ever been in that internal battle when somebody brings you the most delicious looking dessert you've ever seen? I call it the dessert dilemma. You go on a diet. You decide you're going to exercise more. The doctor says you need to cut back in some areas, whatever it may be. And you know that you've made a commitment to cut back on sugar and sweets, right? And you go out to dinner, or you're invited to some kind of event, maybe a wedding or something, and they bring to your table free, delicious dessert. You ever been in that dessert dilemma? And they come and they bring it and they place it right before you. And they say, would you like a dessert tonight, sir? And you go, And maybe your wife is over to the side, or a friend is near you, and they go, oh, it's just for tonight. It's no problem. What is one dessert? And you're saying to yourself, you know, that's right. It's just one dessert. I'll run that off tomorrow, right? So, and it's free. I don't even have to pay for it. And so do you take it? Do you eat it? Even though you've made a commitment not to? Now, come on. Have any of y'all ever been in that internal battle? Some of you can just say no and you're good with it. But you know what I'm talking about, right? Now, that's just silly. That's maybe not silly, but that's a dessert dilemma. But when you're talking about sinful opportunity that is presenting itself to you versus doing what you know God wants you to do, I'm telling you, there's an internal battle that must be won. If you want to be a righteous man, you must learn how to win within. When no one else can see it, when this is taking place, you've got to learn to listen to God, not sell yourself. See, when we convince ourselves, really what we're doing is we're lying to ourselves, then we're believing our own lie. And it happens. This is how so many men get off track. This is how so many men justify their behavior and their actions. Temptation is real for every man. You're not alone. Listen, men, you are not alone in this internal battle. David's internal battle was revenge. Yours may be a hurt in your marriage. It may be a hurt in a friendship. It may be a hurt from work. Somewhere you feel right about justifying yourself, but God's saying, trust me. See, it really comes down to, are you going to do it your way or God's way? Are you going to listen to God or what other people are saying? Your internal battle may not be revenge, although it may be. It could be riches that you're pursuing. It could be pornography that's got a hold of you. It may be pride that is drawing you in. And whatever it may be, the question at hand is this: will you give in to your justification of whatever the sin is, or will you listen to God and obey Him? Listen to God, sell yourself. We must learn to win within. And whatever the battle is, the internal battle must be won if I am going to be a righteous man. The second thing I want you to see is not only this, that you got to resist temptation, specifically revenge for David, but secondly, you've got to respond to God's conviction. Look at verse 5. It says, afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his man, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. So you may read this and say, well, hey, what's the big deal? David didn't kill Saul, right? He just cut off the corner of his robe. What's the big deal? Well, it is a very big deal, big enough that God struck his conscience. See, what David knew was that he was close, very close to killing Saul. Now, that's dangerous. He knew that it was an act of disrespect to the office of king. But what we're going to see rise to the surface is that David feared God. He honored God's structure. He would honor God's anointed. It was not David's responsibility to get even with Saul. It was wrong for him to even, take the first step. When he began to creep toward him, the decision had been made. And he was creeping and fighting this battle within himself. And he cuts off the corner of his robe. And that was sin. David is conscience stricken. What does it mean? It simply means this. It means that David had at that moment justified his actions. David believed his own lie at that moment. And God is still lovingly convicting him that he's wrong. He no longer is going to suppress God's voice. But in being conscience-stricken, he is going to respond to God and make that right. See, this is the point that men, you have to be if you're going to be a righteous man, a righteous father. You've got to be willing, if God convicts you of sin and you are conscience-stricken, you got to be willing to deal with that. You can't hide your sin and prosper, it says in Proverbs. You've got to listen, you got to man up and deal with whatever sin God convicts you of. No matter how hard it is, no matter what you think anybody else is going to think, no matter how it's going to change the direction of your life. If God lovingly convicts you, accept that love. Confess that sin. Get right with God so that you can be the righteous man of God that He wants you to be. How do we know that he confessed his sin to God? Because he willingly now confesses his sin to his men. See, it's not enough to just get right with God. David is the leader. One day he will be the king. He has a responsibility to lead these men by example. And so he confesses to his men. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, and lift up my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. He's making this right with his men. Men, those God has placed under you. Specifically, let's start with your family. You may or may not have people under you in your work environment. But for sure, God's given you your family. And probably most of us have influence in other areas as well, where people look to us for leadership. How is that going? What type of example are you? What type of testimony are you giving off to your family, your workplace, your ministry? I think some of the hardest moments of getting right with God and others have been in my family. I remember when our kids were little, I'd get upset about something and I'd get in the flesh and say something I shouldn't say or do something I shouldn't do. And I'd say, God, forgive me. And then God says, yes, I forgive you, but now I want you to make it right with those I've entrusted to you. See, that was hard. See, silently I can make it right with God, but then to pull my family together, say, Michelle, can you come and get the kids to come and get them all in the room and say, I just want y'all to know, as your dad, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I've had to do that several times. I'm just telling you. My attitude was wrong or my action was wrong, whatever. I can't even remember. And the crazy, as hard as that was for me to make that transition, to bring them in the room, speak those words genuinely from my heart to them, and then they would look at me and go, oh, Dad, we love you, bye. And I'm in, but let me tell you something. That was important. That was an important thing to do for my wife, for my kids, for my Lord, to make those things right. David is making this right in front of his men. Let me say something to you. If you want to have the respect of a godly leader, be a person with a sensitive heart to get right with God and those God's entrusted to you. David's men wanted to attack. They wanted to move forward. They wanted to seize the opportunity. And there is conflict that is going on here in this confession. David is thinking biblically. They are thinking humanly. But in the end, David's men will respect him because they are going to see the power of God in and through him. Even King Saul will be broken in his presence. Now I want you to watch and see what David does as a strong spiritual leader. You really want to see some strength. Watch what he does here. Not only does he confess to them, but thirdly, we will see that a righteous man knows how to rebuke worldly advice. Rebuke worldly advice. Verse 7 says this, with these words, David rebuked his men. Even though he's confessing, you know what they're doing? They're ready to go. You won't do it, I'll do it. We'll do it. Just give us the word. We'll take care of this. We'll end this deal. And it won't be on you, it'll be on us. But David knew it was on him. He commanded his men. He was the one in charge. He gave the orders. So he rebukes his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. He's holding them back. And Saul left the cave and went his way. I want to ask you, men, as a spiritual leader in your home and in other areas of your life, do you have the strength to stand against the voice of your peers? Do you? This is key. We need to stand our ground. We need to be biblically grounded and stand our ground. If we're going to be righteous men, because the voices around us oftentimes will lead us astray. I can only imagine what this looked like as Saul walks away unharmed. David's men had to be there just shaking their heads in unbelief, going, I can't believe this just happened. You wouldn't let us go. What in the world is going on? What is he thinking? They just couldn't probably take it in. They were ready to go home, go back to their families, have places of honor. But none of this is going to happen because David let Saul go. What? Well, they're about to see what godly, righteous leadership is all about. The fourth thing I want us to see is this, the respect. You must respect God's authority. Watch what happens. You know, David could have stayed in the cave. Saul would have gone down, gotten back up on his mule or horse, whatever he was riding, and moved on. Nobody would have known the difference. But watch what David does. Then David went out of the cave, and he called out to Saul, my Lord, the king. When Saul looked behind him, David, just imagine this, bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at the piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. And he's like, man, that is some kind of speech, right? Here's David, prostrated, knelt down, bowing down to Saul the king and saying such words. But do not miss that this whole thing is based on David's love and respect for what? Who? God and God's ways. See, when you love God, you trust His ways. When you love God, you trust His structure and you trust His authority. When you love God, you do life His way, not your way. Here, David humbled himself publicly in verse 8. David expresses his heart openly in verses 9 and 10. David provides the evidence for everyone to see in verse 11. Men, I want to say to you today, when we are resisting the authority God has placed over us, we are in trouble. We must learn, as David did, to respect the position even if we cannot respect the person. God places positions and people of authority over us for reasons. David never affirmed the evil intent of Saul. He is acknowledging that this is God's authority and God's way, period. And this is important for you and I to consider because our testimony of leadership is observed in how we value and honor positions of authority. And I want to ask you, man, how's that going in your home? How is it going? What is your spirit and attitude toward places of authority? How does your family hear you talk about your boss at work? How does your family hear you talk about your government? How does your family hear you talk about your pastors? How does your family hear you talk about your parents who are authorities in your life? And whatever authority God's placed over you. It's so easy to become critical. It's so easy to attitudinally disrespect authority that God has placed in our life. And you may want to push back and say, you don't know the kind of boss I have. You don't know the kind of government I have. You don't know the kind of pastor I have. I don't know. And I may not know. But here's what I do know is that we have a responsibility in the attitude that we have toward the positions of authority that God has placed us under. And if we are not respecting those, we will teach our children not to respect those. We cannot justify the fact that someone else's evil allows us to be evil as well in our attitude toward them. We are not allowed to have a spirit of rebellion. Why? Because it goes against having a spirit of trust toward God's knowing best. Look, our authorities may not deserve respect, but that does not give us the right to disrespect the position and the authority. Our attitude displays our trust in God. It is our testimony. David is, let me just say something. Here's David. He's on the ground. He's prostrate. He's saying these things. He is emanating total trust in God. All of his men are watching. Saul and all of his 3,000 are watching. And people are taken back by what David is saying. And what he's saying is this: I trust God. I don't know why you're hunting me down, but I'm telling you I've not done anything wrong, but I am trusting God, and I did not take your life. See, David's submission to God validated his leadership, and it brought to light Saul's impure motive in a powerful way. This would have never happened if he had taken Saul's life in the cave. We must remember that we cannot control how people treat us, but we are responsible for how we respond. We've got to respect God's authority in our lives. And men, if you're struggling in that arena, you need to make that right. You just do. Because you're a leader by design. God's given you the ability to lead by design. He's given you the position to lead. And if your attitude is disrespect to authorities in your life, you are degrading your leadership. You're confusing the people that are following you about trusting God. You got to respect God's authority. Let's move to the fifth one. Then you've got to rest in God's protection and plan. It's one thing to say it, it's another to live it, right? Watch verse 12. He says, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evil doers come evil deeds. So my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge. You know how many people need to live right here and decide between us? May He consider my cause and then uphold it. May He vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. Do you trust God to protect you, or do you take things into your own hand? In Romans chapter 12, the famous verse, just want to read it to remind us. Beginning in verse 17. Remember what Paul wrote here? He said, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Isn't that what David was talking about in the text here? Yes. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Do we believe that? How many times when we've tried to take the place of God to revenge others, it leads to absolute disaster in our lives? The old saying goes, from evil doers comes evil deeds. He said, I won't touch you. Really what he's saying is this, if I kill Saul, I become like Saul. Can I ask who you're holding a grudge against? Let's just pause for a second and think about that. Who are we holding a grudge against? Who do we have a need to get revenge with? Who do we have a need to set the record straight? Because that evil person doesn't deserve where they are or what they have. Is that my role? Is that your role? I'm not saying God doesn't bring evil to light. He does. He may use you to do that. He may. But when we take it into our own hands, it's a very dangerous thing to do. In 2 Corinthians 2, verses 9 through 11, Paul wrote these words to the church at Corinth as well. He said, the reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. He said, if you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake. There was one that Paul needed to forgive, and he had forgiven, but there were some in the church who wouldn't forgive, and they couldn't trust, they couldn't move on. And then he says in verse 11, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. Unforgiveness, revenge, grudges, the lack to move forward and trust it to God, I'm telling you, is a scheme of the enemy, and he outwits us when we live in its reality. But not David, not here. What David is saying in verse 15 is, I am trusting God that He's got this. I don't have to intervene. I don't have to control this situation. God will protect me. I trust His plan in all of this. Really, what he's saying is this: revenge is not my job. You know what David is at this very moment? Free. And I wonder, do you need to be set free? Do you? There's a lot of people that do. And trust God fully with your situation. You know, I wrote this note about revenge, and it goes like this. It says, revenge makes you the ongoing victim of the person you hate. You constantly relive the hurt. You go over it instead of getting over it. And how true it is. So true. A righteous man knows how to resist temptation, A righteous man knows how to respond to God's conviction. A righteous man will rebuke worldly advice. A righteous man will respect God's authority. A righteous man will rest in God's protection and plan. And a righteous man will reign and rule with integrity. In these closing verses and last point of reigning and ruling with integrity, verses 16 through 22, I won't read them all, but here's what I want you to know. Saul comes and he says some important things. Near the end, he says, listen, when you become king, please don't take revenge on my family. That's really what he's saying. Think about it. Isn't that interesting? But the key thing that he said as he wept aloud was, you are more righteous than I. You are more righteous than I. Here's the king, King Saul. Here's David. And he says to David in front of everyone, as he weeps tears because he knows his life has just been spared, and he says, you are more righteous than I. This whole thing began for David inside this dark cave. I'm telling you, listen, men, I'm telling you, out of absolute nowhere, nobody could have planned it. Here comes Saul. It is a test from God, but it is also a temptation from the men that surrounded him. A test and temptation all rolled up into one opportunity that absolutely came out of nowhere. And isn't that how temptation is? It just comes out of nowhere. And then you've got to learn to win within at that moment. That's where this whole thing started. Are you going to trust God? Are you going to listen to His voice? Or are you going to sell yourself on why your sinful action is okay? A few weeks ago, Memorial Day weekend, I decided to take time to go for a run. So I got dressed, put my shoes on, went outside, and began to run in our neighborhood. And as I began to run, there was something very unusual that day that was taking place that was overwhelming me. And it was the smell of a neighbor barbecuing on this huge grill out in his front yard. He pulled it up with his truck. It had a hitch on it. This thing was huge, smoke billowing out as he's cooking barbecue inside this grill. And I began to run. Whew, boy, that smells good. Man, that smells good. You ever been on a run and you've got to smell something like that? One, you've had to motivate yourself to go out there. Now you're running and you're smelling barbecue. You just want to stop and eat. So I went by the first time and I thought, man, that smells good. And went around the block, came back the second time, and there was a worker working in the house right above. And I mentioned to him, man, that sure must be hard to work and smell that. He said, boy, it sure is. I said, well, it's kind of hard to smell it and run too. So I'm smelling this barbecue while I'm running. The third time around, as I headed toward the grill down the street and I knew it was coming, I said to myself, well, I hope my neighbor's in the yard checking on his meat, because I just want to ask him, say, hey, what are you cooking? And maybe he'll tell me and offer me some, right? And so I'm like, man, that would taste so good. And I'm telling you this story because it was very real at the moment. There was this temptation like, I want to stop running and I want to eat, right? Why am I out here sweating and everybody else is sitting around eating and enjoying this holiday and all? And it was just like this internal battle. And so I went by the third time looking for the neighbor, right? And he's not out there. And so I went, and the fourth time, as I approached the fourth time, I said, no, I'm done with this internal battle. I am here to run, and I'm going to get my exercise in. I'm not thinking about barbecue. It's not going to affect me. I'm done. And I made a decision that I was done with thinking about trying to how to get my neighbor's barbecue, right? But that was an internal battle. Now, I'm going to tell you, men, do you know how many men struggle with an internal battle to satisfy their flesh for revenge, for pornography, for power, for pride, relevance, you name it. Don't tell me that it's not real. It is. David, a man after God's own heart, and there are many places in Scripture we can point where he failed at this, but on this day, he got it right. Did you know that he won the battle against what? A lion? He won the battle against a bear. Did you know he won a battle against a giant by the name of Goliath? Do you know throughout the Scripture, battle after battle, he was known as a victor. In fact, they sang and they danced about his victories, right? I mean, he won victory after victory after victory in all these areas. But I want to say to you, the greatest victory he ever won was with himself on this day internally. It is the greatest victory to win within. Men, do you know how to win within? When God's speaking and the world's speaking. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.